Continue our speculations on how to use design in multi-species work. And I want to start with a caveat. Oh, sorry. All of this really, so a couple of years ago, I was reading Don Quixote again after a long time. And if you haven't read it, it's a fantastic novel. It still reads very contemporary. It doesn't read like something 400 years old. And there's a kind of madness that sets Don Quixote out into the world. And I think that any kind of work in a genuinely multi-species, cross-disciplinary work has a little bit of that quality. So I just wanted to give you that warning. Where I think I want to start today is that design, especially in not just intellectual work, but okay, any kind of system transformation work, design has a kind of universal usefulness to it, right? It's a fantastic organizing principle. And in some sense, you could argue that it may replace logic and reasoning as the universal tool that we all need to think through anything. Right? That's the argument I'm going to be making anyway. And I keep going back to philosophy because at some level, again, philosophy is a universal discipline, right? You can, if you compare, let's say, philosophy with something else, many of your ecologists, so let's take biology as a contrast, you could argue that on the one hand, biology is at least universal with respect to all living things. But in practice, the kind of techniques that we use in biology, methodologic, work only for certain objects that you can think about. While philosophy allows you to write in literary ways, it allows you to write in scientific ways. So, at least from the point of view of the methods, philosophy has always had that kind of universal quality to it. Um, so, just keeping that in mind. So it's a way of addressing the world that sits at the intersection of the humanities, the sciences, the social sciences, actually arts and the real world, if it's done well. And what I'm hoping is that if we can add a layer of design and engineering to philosophy, we are, after all, in the age of AI, then not only can you combine science, religion, and literature, which philosophy has always done, we can also include the making disciplines, right? And design and engineering are making disciplines. And so it also gets us in the direction of, what might be a generalization of artificial intelligence, which is that to know is to make. If we can make a device, say, that allows you to communicate with whales. By the way, there's some absolute fantastic recent work on ecologists who are using machine learning to decode songbird songs. So all of this is happening right now. And so the multi-species studio is exactly the place to be if we want to think about these kind of new developments. In this kind of interdisciplinary philosophizing or design thinking is a skill that all of us should cultivate, right? It's useful in academia, it's useful in civil society, and even if you don't care about any of these things, if you just want to make money, I believe that it's a good skill to have. I do want to warn, I wrote these lines actually more than a week ago before the Nobel Prizes came out. This year, as deep learning got multiple Nobel Prizes in physics, in chemistry. So the fact is that artificial ways of understanding the world, our AI in particular, are having a major hype cycle right now, perhaps too much. But I think there's a genuine possibility that making artifacts, whether AI or not, is a substantial new direction for the growth of knowledge, right? I'm going to go over that slide. Why does design have this quality to it? Why is it a universal discipline? In your mind's eye, imagine a skin, an artificial skin that you layer on top of the whole world, right? Think about it as a conceptual analog of what the Xerox Spark computer scientist Mark Weiss, he coined the term ubiquitous computing, right? So ubiquitous computing, the idea of ubiquitous computing is that wherever you go, there is some computational interface that you have to engage with the world. And at some level, we are already there, right? If you're walking around a city as most of us are these days, you can point your smartphone at pretty much anything and get an answer, either via Google Street Maps or some other touchscreen interface. So we're already there in the era of ubiquitous computing. What we still don't have, and perhaps that's a good thing, is that we can't quite yet manipulate the world that you point to with your smartphone. So I can't look at something and grab it and it'll somehow magically come towards you. Maybe that will happen too. Conceptually, you can imagine that the idea of ubiquitous computing is one in which there is a mythical or an imagined surface that we can layer on top of the whole world, and that surface is always there, whether you know it or not, right? So, in that sense, it's like there is an interface to the entire universe that conceptually you can imagine. And the fact is that we are now in the thick of creating new knowledge devices. AI systems, that's what they really are. These are ways to extract knowledge from the world, but not necessarily in the way that we have done them before. But again, I like coining new terms. You could say that since epistemology is the study of knowledge, these devices that we use to extract knowledge, let's call them epistrons, right? And we have had lots and lots of epistrons in the past. I'm just going to give you a list of ones that exist, at least right now. Physical devices such as telescopes, microscopes, sensors, cameras, all kinds of laboratory equipment, right? Then we have mental devices, just concepts, principles, axioms, laws, theorems. You may not currently think of these as artifacts, right? But they are. So it's not Newton's theory of gravity. So gravity, of course, exists whether humans exist or not. But Newton's theory of gravity is an invention of human beings, and in that sense, it's an artifact. Okay, then we have media forms such as articles, journals, books, websites now. But these are all handheld or mind-held versions of artifacts. We should also think of institutions as artifacts. So there are physical institutions, schools, universities, libraries, and courts. There are also mental institutions. Sorry, before I digress, there are mental institutions that we can call them systems of thought, theories, constitutions, philosophical systems, alphabets, programming languages, equations, mathematical notation. These are all just invented stuff. And I'm using the word institution carefully because it's a term, again, this year's Nobel Prize in Economics is an award to three people who have basically said, and there's a lot to disagree with them, but their basic claim is that countries that have good institutions prosper. And so you could expand that by saying that the more, say, mental institutions you have, and don't think of this as a madhouse, a mental institution is in this framing things like theories and so on. So the more capacity we have for robust mental institutions, the more likely it is that knowledge will progress, right? So the same argument that you could argue for economic prosperity could also be applied to epistemic or knowledge prosperity. Okay. So then the question is, are there new mental and physical institutions and artifacts to be invented? And of course, the most obvious ones are robots, search engines, machine learning systems, the kind of things that people are doing today. I want to underscore how robust and important these institutions, knowledge artifacts have been for human history in general, right? Universities are older than nations. The first, of course, Nalanda doesn't exist right now, at least not in the form that it was before. But if you take the universities in Oxford and Cambridge and Paris and I think Siena, Pisa, maybe, they are quite a bit older than the nations that contain them right now, right? And of course, some books have lasted much longer than the civilizations in which they were written. The Bible, Quran come to mind most obviously, but also quite a bit older if you say take the Epic of Gilgamesh. We don't even know which civilization. Um, wrote that, but it still exists. So knowledge artifacts are really robust. But of course, they are artifacts. In that sense, we should distinguish the artifacts that we have created to know the world from the world itself, right? So the Earth goes around the sun in an elliptical orbit, whether we exist or not. But the equations that describe the Earth's motion vanish when we vanish. So then the question arises, how do we understand this array of knowledge artifacts? What's our way of grasping that system as a whole? And then how do we design new knowledge artifacts? You can probably imagine where I'm going with this, is that Shaktiville, our kind of imagined city, is a knowledge artifact. That's where I want to get to. Shaktiville is an epistron, as I call it. It's space through which we know the world. And I'm using that kind of explicitly in a way. If you remember the second session that we had in this seminar, it was a session on time. The third session was on space. And we, of course, are normally used to the study of space or of time. So we use clocks to measure time, we use rulers to measure space. But what we are usually not aware of is that space itself is a way of knowing the world, right? And we are now, again, if ubiquitous computing or other forms of spatial technologies become much more common, then space creation is as much a possible way of grasping the world through knowledge that as writing theories and equations will be, right? So an imagined city or a city, a model city, so digital twins, for example, are becoming more and more common. Spatialization of the world is increasingly a way in which to know the world, right? And the fact is that it doesn't really fit into any of the previous categories that I mentioned. I'm just going to look at my time. So these were the categories, right? Physical devices, mental devices. But an abstract idea of a space for knowing is not in this list, just to give you, right? And that's because we didn't really talk about simulations. Models, of course, architectural models have been there for a very long time, tend to be literal, and they are tied to very concrete ideas of space. I'm trying to use space in a more general sense. That space is like principle or law, right? There is the law as in the legal profession, and that is, of course, perhaps where most of us encounter the concept of law. But then there is the law as in the law of gravity, which is quite a different use of the word law. And there's a clear relationship between the two. And one of the great discoveries of the last 300-400 years has been that that kind of legal metaphor works as well for the natural world as it does for the social world. And that's without that kind of law-based thinking, we won't have physics. We probably won't even have biology. So the fact that we were able to generalize from law as a very concrete institution to regulate human affairs to a general study of the universe, I'm suggesting that we should think of space and simulations and things like that in the same way. That space, to design spaces just as we design laws, is, I think, a fantastic new opportunity. And it's not like we aren't used to spaces. If you're a religious person or if you have some sense of the sacred, you're probably used to lots of spaces of faith, temples, churches, mosques. Like it's a place where you go and you experience the world in a certain way, right? What we aren't quite used to is the idea that a space is by itself an embodiment of knowledge. So what I mean is that this is maybe just me, maybe you have a different experience, but if you take a classroom, of course, a classroom is a container for knowledge. So there's somebody there in front of you who is transmitting knowledge to you, but you don't look at the walls of the classroom and imbibe knowledge, right? Which is a little bit different from a church or a temple. If you're in a church or a temple, just the walls of the space are already part of the thing that you're worshiping. So there will be icons of saints, or there will be a cross, or there will be various kind of religious figures. And the space itself is conveying faith. But I think that in a classroom, at least in the kind of classrooms I inhabit, the walls themselves don't constitute knowledge. And I think that's going to be the big shift, hopefully, that imagination like Shaktivel can help us uh, get into. Uh, and so, what I want to do is talk about sort of a hypothetical thought experiment, which at least I tried to make real, which can help us get into how an imaginary institution like Shaktivel can help us really experience the future. So I had a thought, this was in 2017, so it's already 7 years ago. So the idea was that let's take, and I live in a Boston suburb called Belmont, but right next to the next town over is a town called Cambridge, famous for universities like MIT and Harvard. And there's a town square called Central Square in Cambridge. And so my thought experiment, which I'd wanted to make real, was that imagine a 1 block radius around the Central Square. And on one day, the idea was on July 4th, 2017, when you cross the imaginary boundary of that block, you will suddenly inhabit the world of 2030 rather than of 2017. So approximately 15 years. The idea being that 15 years is enough of a near future that you can actually somehow, like, if you tried hard enough, you can make the imagination of that near future really concrete. Which is to say, to give you some examples, that once you cross that boundary, no fossil fuel cars would be allowed, only electric vehicles. Once you cross that boundary, all the food in the restaurants, at least that day, would be locally sourced. So you can imagine the kind of things that we would want in climate smart or sustainable future in 2030, and see if we can give people an actual literal experience of that future, but in 2017. Now, as it so turns out, we are closer today to 2030, which was the end state for that experiment, than we are to 2017. But be that as it may, I feel like when I think about the kind of things I was imagining as what the 2017's idea of 2030 would be, there were things that I got totally wrong, and then there are things that I didn't anticipate at all. So to give you just a couple of things, right? Uh, so one kind of vision of that 2030 future is the kind of seamless future that that technologists and especially Silicon Valley capitalist technologists keep telling us, which is I should be able to go into a store, pick up something, and just walk with it, and it'll be automatically charged to my account. Um, Amazon actually, between then and now, it turns out Amazon actually tried that experiment. They started some stores, I believe in New York and London, where you could just do that. You could go into the store, pick up things, and walk out. And the claim was that computer vision technology would just make that fully automated. You might want to ask what happens to all those people who had those jobs. So that's something that I guess capitalists don't think about so much. But ironic and somewhat laughable commentary on it was that the claim was that these stores would be fully automated, but actually what was happening is there was a whole tech support team in India that was looking at all the people in the store all the time, and they were actually, so it's basically you had retail staff halfway across the world rather than in New York or London, and that feels so. There was a lot of online commentary on that, but these kind of systems are possible today, and they will have a commercial life. But what I think I thought would be so much closer, and we are not, is, let's say, electric vehicles, right? I thought that there would be only 100%, that every single, at least public transport, would be fully carbon neutral. Turns out not so much. And so it's much harder to move these big, you could say, meat space systems Politics moves really slowly, and in the US in particular, it's quite difficult when it comes to these kind of issues. Uh, on the other hand, I totally did not predict where we are with generative AI, right? The fact that a certain idea of artificiality has really exploded in the last 3, 4 years was not there in or any of the imaginations that we were looking at in 2017. In that sense, an urban imagination of 15 years. So I feel like the way I think of Shaktiville is as a 15, like it's always 15 years from now. But nevertheless, I feel like we can very concretely try to set into motion and even give people an actual sensory physical experience of that future today. That's the great thing about 15 years. 50 years, I think we would be very hard pressed to do. 100 years, I think would be more or less impossible. But 10 to 15 years, I think we can do a lot more concrete imagination and speculation than we think we can. Nevertheless, the world is both more stickier and more fluid. And there's a claim, I think it's attributed sometimes to Niels Bohr, sometimes to Yogi Berra, sometimes I don't know to whom. As he says, it's very hard to predict, especially the future. So we we can't predict it, but I think having that capacity to imagine the near future in ways that makes that future concrete and gives the experience to as many of us as right now, gives that muscle memory. I think that is one very important use of design. And I'm really hoping that this Shaktiville project helps us do that for multi-species life. Now, uh, design, of course, has this reputation of being about problem solving, right? Famously, as Steve Jobs said, it's design is what works. But speculative design, or the kind of design that we are thinking of, isn't about solving, right? It's actually about possibilities and not about solutions. And this is a screenshot from the book Dunn and Raby's Speculative Everything that was assigned to you. Uh, and Dunn and Raby are quite explicit that you don't want to use design in that kind of solutionist way, right? What they are saying is design is something that should help you nudge your imagination from the present moment to not just probable futures, but to for preferable and plausible futures. So that's broadly the direction in which you want to go. Okay. So I'm going to skip this. So if we take all these caveats seriously,
Just a quick
uh,
time reminder, Rajesh. We're at 30
okay.
minutes.
Okay. All right. I am going to try to finish in the next 2 or 3 minutes. That I'm glad that I skipped those slides that I did. If we take all of these caveats seriously, the caveats being this, that design and is really about opening up our imaginations to preferable futures, but that are still plausible. Okay, not utopian futures. What is the vision of technology that expands our intellectual capacity? And when I say technology, it doesn't have to be high tech, it doesn't have to be gizmos. It really is just how can artifacts help us expand our intellectual capacity? How can we imagine the different aspects of Shaktiville in this way? And I think, Sartaj, I believe that you're going to talk about transportation today as one of the specific things that we want to reimagine, right? So the first thing we want to do is spaces where humans and non-humans inhabit each other's worlds. A future technology might help us actually see the world from the point of view of a dog or in perhaps a much further future, a honeybee. But being able to do that, so part of this is, of course, the technology that makes it real. But actually, far more important in my view is the imagination and the empathy where we co-inhabit spaces with other creatures as also having their own worlds. Right? So that's a mental shift. And let me make that explicit when we talk about humans. A city is full of people who are quite different from each other. Now, you could just walk around the city and totally ignore other people. You can ignore the colonies that they live in. You may be wealthy and you have absolutely no concern for someone who has no who's poor. And that's a very impoverished way of living in a city. You could, of course, be the opposite, right? We could have deep empathy for how other people live their lives. And the city gives you the opportunity to engage with that. Can we extend that to non-humans, right? Can we walk around a city recognizing that there are creatures who are different from us, who nevertheless are sharing the same space, and that they have a it's a commons. They have a right to be in that space in the way that you do, right? And in that sense, they should be safe spaces for non-humans as well. And safe, so safety, trust, empathy, these affective capacities are as important as technical capacities. And that's why an artifact, like a spatial artifact like Shaktiville, should hopefully bake in both these emotional capacities that we have as much as the technological wizardry that we might want to put into it, right? So that's really where I would like to end with today, which is that think of this as an interverse. So I hate the term metaverse. I used to like it, but then it became something that Silicon Valley starts selling to us. So the interverse for me is it's not the shared world, right? I actually don't, one of the readings that we will have later on in this studio by Uxkul tells you that the animal world is not the same as our world, right? We overlap. So there's an intersection between the two, but let's not assume that it's the same world that we're both inhabiting. And to me, the phrase that captures that overlapping worlds that we inhabit is interverse. So how is a imagined space like Shaktiville an interverse in which very different creatures are both walking around in their own bubbles, but there's enough overlap that we share a common reality of some kind? That's really the question I want to end with. Thanks. So I guess what we're going to do is a few Q&A, and then we're going to move to Sataj.
So let me begin with, so we have, I think, just about 5 minutes. So one comment I want to make, and I want your reaction on that, is that in every aspect of, like when you spoke of either knowledge devices or design as a knowledge interface, or in the final overlap with other animals, I feel like we are severely restricted by our awareness. Like the fact that Uxkul wrote an essay about Umwelt
Uh-huh.
is that he was aware of the Umwelt of other organisms.
Mhm.
And I feel like no amount of AI or deep learning can substitute that increase in awareness, which we just have to work hard for.
Uh-huh. I wouldn't necessarily, I mean, of course, Erskine is a very gifted observer. If you read his book, he starts with ticks. So forget mammals. We are talking about a creature very different from us. And he has such an empathetic description of the tick to start with. And yes, that capacity to observe is absolutely crucial. I do think that it can be expanded using technology. I'm not saying that maybe I'm enough of a technophile that I believe that observation can be enhanced, but you still want to pay attention. Uh, So a kind of attention training is absolutely crucial. And that cannot be taken over by technology, that's for sure. Like we need to be able to have a way of experiencing the world that is deeply attentive to those other creatures. And it might be interesting, even in maybe the studio we may not be able to pull it off, but what that would look like. Is there how to train that attention in us?
Yeah. So we have 3 minutes for any other questions.
Yeah. Thanks, Anshuman, for posting that book. Any questions from the audience? If not, I think I can hand it over to Sartaj. I'll
Yeah.
stop sharing.
And you should be able to see my screen now. So I'll talk first briefly about transport, and then I'm going to take a few minutes to talk about the app that I wrote about in the email called iNaturalist. So transport systems in as they relate to Shaktival, which is like an urban setting, should fulfill certain tasks for us. And this is in an ideal world how you would design a street in an urban setting where there is a smooth flow of traffic, a place to park cars, and a lane for public transport. There is cycling lanes and walking paths. But of course, in the real world, we usually do not have enough space to pull this off. So, one thing to think about is it okay to then acquire land on both sides of the road to expand the road to fit this setting? And it comes with its legalities, but also the morality of it. Like, how moral is it to buy people's land and move them? This is what the reality looks like in a lot of places. This is a photo from Gangtok, where we have trains of taxis that take you to wherever you want to go. It helps because these taxis are mostly private and you just hop in and hop off. People stick to their lanes because they've learned that traffic jams are quite dangerous in a place like this. Things are more chaotic in other parts of the country, and they lead to loss of time mostly, and also restrict access to a lot of places that you would want to go to. The video that I had shared in the email was from, they have won the award for the most sustainable and most integrated transport systems 2 years in the running. And so there's a lot to learn from that. I'll just read from the slide. Improved efficiency of transport systems. It leads to increase in happiness of customers, reduce travel time, save money, and it's better for the environment. So the takeaway from Jakarta's system, the most important one was that integrating transport systems is what makes it really efficient. If you can have a single ticketing system that will cover your end transport, which is from your home to the nearest transport. In that case, it's a micro bus, they call it. Then there is the bus, then the subway, and at the other end, again, there's a bus and a microbus. So if a single ticketing system can cover all of this and the timetables align really well, it increases access to a large part of the city for everybody. And the learnings from the video, I've just put them in the slide, is that you raised incremental and long-term approach. So as you scale up, you do it slowly. You engage with stakeholders from an early stage. You go from independent operators to cooperatives. You establish legally binding contracts at every level. You develop intermodal infrastructure, which fits into each other, like the buses feeding the subways are integrated in terms of fare and times. And you must make sure that this is inclusive. So everybody can access this public transport and it is equitable. But there are larger costs to transport, which go beyond all of this, like ecological costs of building roads in the hills, for instance, come at the cost of landslides, which not only disrupt transport, but are also not great for the ecology of the hills themselves. And then there is the problem of roadkills, because we share these spaces with other organisms who have to not only live in the area, they need to cross these roads as well. A case study that I've taken for this one is from Valparai, where there are lion-tailed macaques, which is this monkey that you see crossing the road. And I've taken this case and not rhesus macaques because these are endangered and are not found in many very many places. So we do have to coexist with them. So you begin by increasing awareness and get people to slow down every time the monkeys are crossing the road. And then there are overbridges which connect the canopy so they don't have to come to the road at all. And they can just cross on these overbridges, which is one way that Valparai has dealt with coexisting with lion-tailed macaques. And it's extremely successful. Their mortalities come down and there are fewer accidents on the road. Traffic also causes other problems, which we're not entirely aware of at all times. Light pollution is one. In coastal regions, sea turtles, when they hatch, sea turtles lay their eggs on the beaches. And when the babies hatch, they look at light on the horizon to distinguish the land side from the seaside. On the seaside, they see starlight coming right down to the sea and they know which way to go. But because of traffic and lights from cities, they get confused and they start walking in the opposite direction. So light pollution because of roads and traffic is a big problem. There is a design solution to it, which is to use lamps that reduce light pollution. These lamps have already been used in many places. A good example is public parks in Chandigarh, which light only the footpaths and cause no light pollution. Not only is it good for other organisms, it's also very aesthetically pleasing, and you can actually stargaze while being in these parks. Traffic also causes noise pollution, and all sorts of transport, be it land-based, airborne, or sea-based, disrupts ecosystems by the noise that it creates. These problems of the pollution of light, sound, also have to be accounted for when you design a transport system for Shaktivel. But another thing that we have to consider is that while we think of roads as increasing access, they also fragment habitat. And this study shows that linear infrastructure like roads have fragmented the whole world into 600,000 fragments, which means it's bounded by roads on all sides. The smallest of these fragments are less than a kilometer square. And this color graph shows the density of road networks across the world. 1 kilometer buffer, the roads with 1 kilometer buffer, is because the most disruption is caused in the 1 kilometer buffer on either side of a road. So this is what the world looks like today in terms of its linear infrastructure, which is rails and roads. And what alternatives to this do we have? So most of our vehicles are wheel-based and require roads. One alternative is using drones as delivery systems, which of course come with their own problems of which we're not even entirely aware of yet. Like how will it disrupt bird movement, or how will you then regulate traffic of drones, which is all we have to still think of. But this is a startup. I had shared a video about the startup and how they're doing this and all problem solving that they're doing at this stage. Another idea is to have a non-wheel-based transport system like Boston Dynamics load-carrying robots, which don't even require roads. However, they do have a very high production cost and they might not be very feasible as compared to the drones. But there are other ideas as well, and these are just two that I've shared. And that is all I have to say about the transport bit. I will go into iNaturalist, but before I do that, let me quickly tell you what today's activity will be. So once we break out into groups, after I explain to you what iNat is, you will have to add transport as a module to your idea of Shaktivel. So the documents that you're building, to that you have to add how did Shaktivel come to have a sustainable, integrated, ecologically friendly transport system. I have about 10 minutes to explain iNatched now. I had shared a link to the website as well. what we want you to do is download iNat on your phones and upload pictures of, you were supposed to upload pictures of 3 insects until this week. I'll explain to you how this works. Before I start, is there anybody who has downloaded iNat? Can you just quickly say yes or no in the chat? That is so good to see. Okay, I will quickly run through. So these are basically screenshots. Yeah, these are basically screenshots from my phone. So this is what my interface looks like. Once you open iNat, it opens up just like Instagram, actually, an Instagram for the natural world. So you click on the plus and it takes you to this page. How do you want to upload an image? Do you want to take a picture now or choose from your gallery? So I usually choose from gallery. And this is what my gallery would look like after I've been taking pictures of insects. And then, so I've already gone through these, cropped them, and kept them ready. And I will choose the ones I want to upload, say these two, and takes me to this page. And then I click on what did you see? And it shows you suggestions that look visually similar. And the cool thing with this is that it lets you compare them. So I click on the first one, and it shows me large images, plus it shows me the geographical distribution that you can see below, which is here. So if it shows me an insect which is not geographically distributed where I am, I know it is not that. So I use both of these data to then figure out what I'm looking at. So this image, when I saw this, I figured that the abdomen of the ants looks like the abdomen of the ants that I had taken a picture of. So I select it. Then it asks me the location of where the picture was taken. I can either choose it on the map or, so once I have saved a location, it also lets me choose pinned locations. Or you can just select it on the map, enter an address, and you're good to go. The only other thing it asks you is whether it was captive or cultivated, which is this box, or if it was wild. If it isn't cultivated or captive, you leave it unticked, and then you're good to upload. And that's a new upload done on iNat. So I had started out saying that you just need to take pictures of 3 insects in the first week. However, this week we have a competition for you. And until next week, we're going to see who can take pictures of the most number of insects, the most number of species of insects. And the winners will be declared in the next session. You can post your pictures on the Discord channel. And also we will ask you once we start the next session. So if you have any comments about or questions about any of this, you can ask us now. I haven't used Seek, Ranjit. Do you want to tell us about it? Okay.
Okay. We'll have to take a look.
Let me just take this few minutes to tell you more about iNaturalist. What the idea is that you will soon realize that to find insects, you have to go to certain kinds of places. And neat kept places are not where you will find insects. It reminds me of this story where the father gives his 3 sons an apple each and says, eat them when nobody is watching you. And the first son goes behind the garden shed and eats his apple. And the second son is about to do so, and he sees a bird sitting on the tree and he doesn't eat it. He waits for the bird to fly away and then eats the apple. And then the third son is about to eat his apple and he sees ants walking up the tree. And wherever he goes, there are insects. And so he can never eat his apple because there's life everywhere. We've created worlds where there are places where there is no living thing, like in a lot of our rooms and in a lot of urban settings. But it shouldn't be too hard to find insects. Yes, it is only insects for this week. As in, you can have arthropods, spiders, moths, butterflies, all of these. Everything counts. Yes, butterflies count, butterflies, moths. spiders. Yes. So apart from just identifying what the insect is, iNaturalist lets you record, it basically geotags your observations and lets you keep a record of what you've seen where. And it's also an open source record for anybody who then wants to see where a particular insect is found or how often it's been seen. Yeah, sometimes they're not accurate, but also in some ways it is, even if you take pictures of a caterpillar, they lead you to the moth directly, which is quite useful.
I'm going to try downloading that other app also just to see what it does.
Okay. Anshuman, can I request you to put the Google
He's already
Doc
done that.
links? Oh,
He's already done that. Yeah. Thanks, Anshuman.
cool. So I think we can head over to the Google Docs then.
Yeah.
And so you can clear up the docs, make it a more coherent document, and add transport to it. Two things that you must keep in mind is what kind of transport system does it have and how did it get there? The second step is just as important as the first one. Okay.